I lost my plate. I'm back. Catholicism. For Catholicism. The teaching, structure, and rituals of the Catholic Church are built on the same thinking as that of simple horticultural societies in which adolescent boys are made into men by the adult males of the society. Although both sexes are initiated at puberty, the rites differ. When a girl begins to menstruate, she is isolated, usually deprived of food, drink, or comfort, and often demeaned. Men initiate boys in groups. In a ritual that imitates birth through the mother, men force boys to undergo a second birth through men. This second birth is brutal and intimidating. The men may beat or otherwise injure them. They may cut their penises, spilling the boy's blood in imitation of female menstruation, or sending them through a frightening human tunnel that mimics the vaginal canal. Whatever the ritual, it teaches boys that to be men they must renounce the mother, be reborn through men, and maintain male solidarity against women. They are taught men's secret ways of terrifying women, with the fearful sound of a swinging whip, say, taught that the essence of maleness is control of female power. The ritual teaches boys to war against women, to subjugate them as they are being subjugated by male solidarity and intimidation. The primary founding mystery of the Catholic Church is a God who utters the word that becomes flesh, birth through a male. The mutual love of father and son issues in reproduction, a third figure, the Holy Ghost. Both these acts symbolically appropriate the exclusively female power of birth. The mystery involves the belief that all three exist in all time and none precedes the other. Beyond that, the hierarchy of the Church imitates and appropriates the transmission of this power from mother to daughter. Men not only symbolically usurp a female power, but characterize their version of it as higher, spiritual, and thus more exalted than mere animal powers. Gloria Steinem points out that the architecture of Catholic churches mimics the female body. The outer portals serve as the labia majora, the inner portals as labia minora, the side altars as ovaries, and the high altar the uterus at the heart of the swelling dome that holds the body of the faithful, the child. Immersion in or sprinkling with holy water at baptism, a rite called rebirth, mimics the water in which the fetus lives. The God ingested at communion is a symbolic version of the actual nourishment a mother provides to her fetus and her newborn baby. All Christian sects hold that the sexes are equal in the eyes of God, but actual equality is deferred to an afterlife, and leaders stressed equality only when they were first attempting to establish their churches. Women, major figures in the founding and spread of Christianity, were very powerful within the Roman Church from its early years until the High Middle Ages. But once it had political control of Europe, the Church excluded women from any form of power and shut up once active nuns in cloisters. Unlike Judaism, Islam, or Protestantism, Roman Catholicism is not a religion of male consensus, changing over centuries in accordance with commentaries of important male religious figures on basic texts. Its forms and its dogma, the beliefs one must accept to be a member of the Church, have not changed much over the centuries. The main shifts in its forms were forbidding priests to marry and later to keep concubines, ending certain fasting requirements, and reading the Mass in vernacular languages. The main changes in dogma were the consecration of the Virgin Mary, declaring her Immaculate Conception, 1854, papal infallibility, 1870, Mary's bodily assumption into heaven, 1950, the later deconsecration of some legendary saints, many of them female, and a hardening of its position against contraception by any means but abstinence, 1968. Most of these changes were detrimental to women in some way, but the Church's position on birth control and abortion is the most injurious. It is hard on both men and women, but while men are expected to support their families, there is no sin in failing. Women have to bear and raise the children. Women are the ones who suffer most when children suffer, starve, and die. Because its stance has for so long been anti-women, denying women power both within the hierarchy and in local parishes. And because it has always opened an avenue for men to attain power in the world, The Catholic Church has not generated a need for a fundamentalist movement. It never abandoned fundamental male dominance, but its patriarchal rules, like those of other religions, fell under siege during the 1960s by the sexual and feminist revolutions. While many blame the 1960s sexual revolution on feminism, it was surely instigated more by men like Freud and Havelock Ellis than by feminism. The sexual revolution legitimated sex. Once sex was recognized as a basic need rather than a taint, men felt legitimate in demanding it openly. Instead of going over the fence as they had earlier, priests of conscience began to press for the right to marry. Although the Catholic priesthood now accepts defectors from Anglicanism, which allows priests to marry, it continues to forbid marriage to its own priests. Far fewer men are entering the priesthood, but the Church is immovable on the celibacy issue. The same steadfast opposition characterizes the Church's treatment of women petitioning the Vatican to allow female ordination. On the issue of abortion, the Church has not been steadfast, but has become more militant and oppositional. In the United States, it has even allied with Protestant fundamentalists. Jane O'Reilly shows that the Catholic Church, not fundamentalist or the political right wing, is responsible for the drive to criminalize abortion in the United States. Yet it has not historically been so opposed to abortion. During its first 6 centuries, the Church took the position that abortion was not murder because a fetus had no soul. Augustine held that one cannot be said to be deprived of a soul if one has not yet received a soul. The law does not provide that the act pertains to homicide, for there cannot be said to be a live soul in a body that lacks sensation. If it is not yet formed in flesh, and so not yet endowed with senses. The early Church accepted women-hating Aristotle's pronouncement on the beginning of life. A male fetus becomes human 40 days after conception. Women-hating Aristotle. Yup. A female 90 days after conception. Becoming human is not the same as quickening. It is not a biological, but a symbolic quality, something simply said to occur. The Church considered abortion wrong mainly because it concealed real sin, adultery, and fornication. It not only was not murder, but was punished less seriously than illicit sex, bribery, theft, or divination. The 7th century Irish canon ordered 14 years of penance for one who had intercourse with a neighbor woman, and 3.5 years for destruction of the embryo of a child in a mother's womb. The Irish Penitential Code, c. 800, ordered 3.5 years penance for willful miscarriage after the fetus was established in the womb, 7 years if flesh had formed, and 14 years if the soul had entered. An 8th century penitential, possibly by Bede, ordered a year's penance for a mother who killed a fetus before the 40th day. She was a murderer only if she killed her baby after birth. But even this was judged according to her situation. A poor woman who could not support a child was judged more leniently than a harlot trying to conceal her wickedness. The first authoritative code of canon law, compiled by Gratian in 1140, stood until 1917. It decreed abortion homicide only when the fetus was formed. Again, at 40 days if male, 90 if female. In 1588, Pope Sextus V, a fanatical anti-sex Puritan, trying to rid Rome of all extramarital sex, issued a papal bull, Ephrainatum, decreeing all abortion and contraception murder. But Gregory XIV annulled it in 1591, returning to the earlier position that abortion was not homicide early in a pregnancy because the fetus was not human. There was no further pronouncements until 1869, a year before the doctrine of papal infallibility was issued. Apostolicae Sedis, issued by Pius IX, directing that abortion at any stage be punished by excommunication, became part of canon law in 1917. Yet to this day, the Church rarely baptizes fetal miscarriages or even full-term stillborns, does not, in other words, treat them as living creatures with souls. Thus, only in the 19th century After women had begun to agitate for rights, did the Pope declare his own infallibility ex cathedra, and the Church firmly oppose abortion. It did not begin to wage war against women until 1968, when feminism revived and women began to demand rights over their own bodies. In that year, Paul VI issued Humanae Vitae, forbidding contraception and all abortion, even for therapeutic reasons. In 1974, a year after abortion was legalized in the United States by Roe v. Wade, the Vatican issued a declaration against abortion, on abortion, that finessed any uncertainty about when life begins, claiming that to abort a fetus was to risk committing murder. It named it a grave sin. The Catholic Church opposes abortion on the specious ground that it is murder if a fetus is a living being. Neither the Catholic Church nor Protestant fundamentalists or their allies in the campaign to criminalize abortion have ever shown much compunction about murder. The clergy accompany soldiers to war and bless battles. Pro-lifers ardently support executions and war. The murder of people who may be enemies today, what will be friends tomorrow? If life is sacred before it exists, it should be even more so once it breathes in a person. Because churches have shown over the millennia that they sanction murder. Indeed, on many occasions, Christianity and Islam have been its agents, killing on religious grounds. Of all world religions, only the Quakers have ever held all killing wrong. One doubts that reverence for life motivates the campaign to criminalize abortion. No church opposes capital punishment. Moreover, a study by Catholics for Free Choice shows that legislators who oppose legal abortion also, almost across the board, oppose economic and social assistance to poor women and children. They want women to bear the babies they conceive. After that, they are on their own. This is not concern for life, but repression of women. The real motivation of the Catholic Church is revealed by several of its positions. It denies women control over their own bodies by forbidding contraception and abortion, by teaching women they are subordinate in marriage. A subordinate woman does not have the right to refuse conjugal intercourse. In addition, its justifications for constricting women have often involved racism. This is a historic fact. Men have justified imprisoning women in Purda during periods when an alien group was coexisting in the same territory. Steinem cites Father Paul Marks, director of the Human Life Center, an anti-abortion think tank in Minnesota, who argues that the white Western world is committing suicide through abortion and contraception. Pointing to the large families of the many people of color in his area, he insinuates that they would be unwilling to fight the Russians should that become necessary. That particular threat has collapsed, but Marx is busily contriving similar arguments. Abortion has always existed, whether it was legal or not, because it is necessary. Like infanticide, abortion has been legal when men controlled it. Those who oppose it may criminalize it but cannot eradicate it. All they can do is send it underground, make it harder for poor women to obtain, and I'm sure that more women die of it. Robin Morgan points out, 30 to 50% of all maternal deaths in Latin America are due to improperly performed illegal abortions or to complications following abortion attempts. Every 10 minutes in 1980, an Indian woman died of a septic abortion. Illegal abortion is a leading cause of female deaths in Caracas. In Peru, 10 to 15% of all women in prison were convicted for having illegal abortions. 60% of the women in one Lima prison were there for having had or performed illegal abortions. If the pro-life campaign succeeds, far more women will die of illegal abortions, and more women will have babies they do not want or cannot support, adding to the burden borne by welfare agencies. We must question the motivation underlying a campaign directed at such ends. The real motivation of the campaign to criminalize abortion is to establish the principle that women's bodies belong to the state and that women bear the responsibility for sex. In October 1984, just before the presidential elections, 24 nuns and 4 priests joined in signing an advertisement in the New York Times protesting John Cardinal O'Connor's attacks on Democratic vice presidential candidate Geraldine Ferraro for her pro-choice position. The Vatican immediately ordered the signers to recant or be dismissed. The priests were silenced in a matter of months. It took 2 years to silence the nuns. By May 1988, two still would not recant: Barbara Ferraro, no relation to Geraldine Ferraro, and Patricia Hussey, who had between them 47 years of service as Sisters of Notre Dame's in Namur, working mainly for poor children and women. In July, they resigned from their order, but they remained in the church and now run a shelter for the homeless in Charleston, West Virginia. Fundamentalist Protestants provide a facade in most protests about legal abortion. The Catholic Church is the power in the background, providing money and propaganda. Interesting. That its animus is less moral outrage at murder than outrage at female autonomy is suggested by the fact that Catholic clergymen who denounce political figures target mainly women. They helped destroy Geraldine Ferraro, a Catholic for choice. For having the temerity to run for national office. Seriously moved against New York Governor Mario Cuomo, also a Catholic for choice, who is nationally known, far better known than Ferraro before she ran for vice president. This, one might think, would be reason to make an example of him. But the church prefers to hit women, who are less powerful and presumably can't hit back. A bishop excommunicated Lucy Killia, a Catholic for choice, when she ran for local office in California. This backfired. Women outraged by the act rallied to her support and she won. Bishop Rene H. Gracida excommunicated Rachel Vargas and Elva Bustamante, who direct Texas abortion clinics. The only men I know of, I do not have comprehensive data on this, who have been persecuted by religious agents for supporting legal abortion are both members of minorities. Gracida also excommunicated Dr. Eduardo Aquino, an obstetrician at one of the Texas clinics, and a Catholic nurse in a Boston hospital accused Dr. Kenneth Edelin, a black obstetrician, of murder for aborting a fetus. He was acquitted, but only after a ravaging trial. If the church per se did not precipitate this event, its campaign did. The drive to criminalize abortion is unremitting. Considering most men's disinterest in their children and their frequent abandonment and failure to support their children, the fervor with which Catholic or Protestant fundamentalist men fund campaigns to criminalize abortion is nothing short of astounding. Moving from state to state to erode legal abortion, the church flooded state legislators with nearly 400 abortion statutes in 1990. Most were defeated, but 4 states and 1 territory passed criminalizing measures. The criminalizing campaign forces women to fight the same battle over and over again, when they would prefer to spend their energies on other struggles for women's rights. Moreover, while a legal struggle fills the headlines, the anti-abortion forces are winning the battle in the trenches. By harassing doctors who perform abortions, picketing their homes, and verbally assaulting their families, they have intimidated most of them. While abortion remains a legal right, only a minority of women can actually obtain them. Ann Schreiber reveals that from 1977 to 1988, access to abortion decreased by 51%, as more and more doctors refused to perform them. Only 17% of counties in the country have some kind of abortion service. Half the urban counties and a staggering 93% of rural counties had no known abortion services in 1988. Hospitals, which used to perform over a third of all abortions, now perform only 10%. The rest are performed in clinics, many of them embattled. Some states, like North Dakota, have no doctors willing to perform abortions. South Dakota has 1. A few courageous physicians fly from city to town to offer the service, yet do not escape harassment at home. As usual, women with money to travel can obtain legal abortions. Poor women and girls are barred from legal abortion as effectively as if by law, in a circumvention of law by intimidation, terrorism. Canada. The American campaign to criminalize abortion is being waged by an alliance of male-dominated fundamentalist Protestant churches and the exclusively male Catholic clergy. But the Catholic campaign is worldwide. On the heels of a feminist victory in Canada, the church initiated a campaign that may cause the rescission of legal abortion there. In 1981, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, equivalent to the American Constitution, was due for overhaul. As legislators debated, women across the country rose up, grassroots groups joining organized feminists to demand a statement of sexual equality. They succeeded, an equal rights clause was added to the charter that year. At that time, Canada had a law permitting abortions in principle. A woman had to petition a panel of 3 physicians for approval, and the operation had to be performed in a hospital. No clinics existed. Since many hospitals were run by the Catholic Church, in practice abortion was hard to obtain. Abortion became legal in Canada largely because of one man, Henry Morgentaler, an Auschwitz survivor who emigrated to Canada and became a physician. During the 1970s, he openly performed abortions in Montreal, where poor Catholic women, forbidden birth control, sorely needed them. He was arrested and imprisoned several times. In jail, overcome by memories of Auschwitz, he suffered a heart attack, but he was tried twice for the same act and acquitted. In this period, Quebec province was quietly rebelling against the authority of the Anglo-Saxon Canadian government and the Roman Catholic Church. Convinced that no jury would convict people for performing abortions, Quebec announced that despite federal law, it would no longer prosecute such cases. Morgentaler opened clinics throughout the country in provinces where abortion was still illegal. He was again prosecuted. Women across Canada lobbied and raised money to help him when in 1988, a few years after the Equal Rights Clause was passed, Morgentaler's case reached the Supreme Court. Declaring the abortion law discriminatory against women, the court struck it down, simply erasing abortion from the acts regulated by the state, essentially decriminalizing it. The conservative Canadian government immediately drew up a new law punishing pregnant women and physicians who participated in abortion with 2 years in prison, unless the abortion was necessary for physical or psychological reasons, exceptions that always function to allow women with money, but not poor women, to get abortions. The Catholic Church helped fund the campaign to pass this bill and lobbied Canada's large Catholic population. During this debate, over 300 physicians across Canada announced they would no longer perform abortions. A teenager who could not get a safe abortion tried to abort herself with a coat hanger and died. Found on the floor beside the bloody hanger, she became a symbol for CARAL, the Canadian Abortion Rights Action League, which fought to defeat the bill. But when it came to the Canadian Senate, which usually defers to the government, it was defeated by an old alliance between male pro-lifers who opposed it as too lenient and women opposed to criminalizing abortion. As of 1991, Canada had no law covering abortion. It may be the only nation in the world so situated. Moreover, the province of Ontario, for the first time in its history in 1990, elected a social democratic government, the New Democratic Party, which has named 11 women to the 26-member cabinet, many with economically powerful, high-profile portfolios. It funds abortion clinics and provides money for women to travel to them from outlying districts. Still, abortion is not easily available in most of Canada, a huge country with a widely dispersed population. In northern regions and the maritime provinces, the sole hospital is often Catholic and refuses to do abortions. Women without money to travel to large cities may have to resort to coat hangers. The Church will probably continue its efforts pressuring the federal and provincial governments opposed to legal abortion to continue to deny funding to abortion clinics. The Church funds REAL Women, a female front organization like the American Eagle Forum led by Phyllis Schlafly. Real Women lobbies against public funding for any agency that helps women by funding abortion clinics or women's centers that counsel battered women, incest survivors, rape victims, and poor women needing shelter or legal help. Real Women also opposes publicly funded daycare and equal pay for equal work. When a new bishop was named in Toronto in 1990, his first act was to remove lay women filling priestly functions and all altar girls. As Canadian journalist author Michelle Landsberg comments, all orthodoxies are founded on the domination and control of women. Poland. The Catholic Church is also pressing to criminalize abortion in Europe, Africa, and Asia. Across the world, the Pope is strategically appointing extremely conservative bishops, especially in liberal urban centers. The Church backs resurgent nationalist movements in many Eastern European states, which may be why so many of them have an anti-Semitic component, and where it is strong, as in Poland and the Yugoslav Republic of Croatia, it is waging a battle to criminalize abortion. To understand its power in Poland, we must look briefly at Polish history. Poland, partitioned throughout the 19th century, did not produce a strong women's movement. People with the courage and resources to rebel dedicated themselves to the struggle for independence. Each generation mounted a new insurrection in Russian-controlled Poland. Partition kept Poland poor, and most women were beaten down by poverty, which is always hardest on women. Yet many took part in uprisings, directly or by endorsing men's revolt, raising children and maintaining households without men, who were imprisoned, exiled, or killed. The Enthusiasts, the first organization for improving women's education and status, were active in 1840 to 50. Members also worked in the underground independence movement. Most were imprisoned or exiled by the Russians. The first Polish vocational school for women was created in the 1890s. Women were admitted to universities in Austrian-controlled Poland, Galicia, in 1897. The Polish Society for Equal Rights for Women was founded in 1907, and when Poland regained independence in 1918, women won the right to vote and run for office. A women's movement suddenly emerged. Between the wars, over 80 women's organizations flourished in Poland. Poland was devastated by World War II. A third of its people and 90% of its livestock died, bombed and shot by invading Germans, burned when they retreated, then bombed and shot by invading Soviets. After the war, the Soviets imposed a communist system on a hostile population and banned independent organizations, replacing grassroots women's groups with a mass organization, the Women's League. By law, the sexes were equal, though as late as 1960, women made up less than a third of the workforce. But in 1970, they were 40% of workers, and by the mid-1980s, 45%. They gradually increased their numbers in education too, and now have more education than men. In 1987, 30% of Poles had a secondary education or more, 27% of men and 33% of women. In 1989 to 90, women made up 51.3% of university students, but also 62% of registered, no doubt many more of actual unemployed. In a shifting economy, firms reduced their staffs and the first dismissed are women. Poles never stopped squirming in Russia's fist, rebelling in 1956 and again in the 1980s as the Solidarity movement spread across the country. In June 1989, Poland held the first free elections in Eastern Europe since 1939. These elections were not totally free. The Communist Party controlled 65% of the seats in the Sejm, lower parliamentary house. Poles voted on the remaining 35% of the Sejm and on the Senate, a newly created upper house. They elected 6 women to the 100 Senate seats and fewer women to the same Sejm than the communists had. Indeed, when the people had a voice in elections, the number of women in the Sejm drops. During the 1956 uprising, it fell from 17% to 4%. In 1989, from 23% to 20%. Yet Poland never fostered segregation like all-male clubs until recently, when it began to imitate the West. Sexism varies in its forms. The Catholic Church was vital to the survival of the independence movement in Poland. The Church flourished despite 50 years of communist persecution, the only alternative institution to the party, offering a personal space within a totalitarian system and supporting traditional Polish values. But what are those values? The male-dominated family, irrevocable monogamous marriage, and regulated sexuality. Perhaps the major item on its agenda was to criminalize abortion, which it has fought fiercely since 1956, when abortion was legalized in Poland. In 1958, the PAX Catholic Association appealed to the Sejm to annul it and urged the faithful, especially medical workers, to sabotage it. Most socialist states had legal abortion, but also promoted a high birth rate. To encourage large families, they saw to it that contraceptives were both unreliable and in short supply, making abortion the major form of birth control. But abortions were performed savagely. Socialist states thus put women in an untenable position, already overburdened with wage work. Domestic maintenance and childcare. They could not afford large families, and in cities had no room for them. Women without birth control, but with the right to abortion, were essentially punished for using it. Still, an estimated half of all pregnancies in Poland ended in abortion. When the Poles courageously stood up to the Soviet Union, Solidarity sought the help of the Catholic Church, the prime institution of resistance in Poland. The male-dominated church offered support on the condition that male-dominated Solidarity criminalize abortion in an independent Poland. Solidarity agreed, and at independence, Joseph Cardinal Klemp immediately launched a campaign to criminalize the termination of a pregnancy under any circumstances. The Catholic Church also influenced Solidarity to curtail the availability of contraceptives. It backed the creation of lay Catholic groups, Care for Life, Gaudium Vitae, Pro Familia, organized marches, and collected subscriptions in churches to fund the campaign. In 1989, the church proposed a law punishing anyone connected with the death of an unborn child by a prison term of up to 3 years, with no conditions or exceptions. 74 Sejm deputies, 8 of them women, submitted this extraordinary bill. The bill not only bans abortions and penalizes mother insertion with prison sentences, but grants a fetus legal status from the moment of conception. Once born, a child may demand compensation for damages suffered as a fetus. The bill does not specify what kind of damages. Małgorzata Futsara, the professor at the Warsaw Institute of Applied Social Sciences, writes that the rule is so broad a child could conceivably sue its mother for any act that may be construed as having affected it negatively. The bill enjoins parents, whether married to each other or not, to care for the child from the moment of conception until maturity, placing duties on the father beyond those at present enjoined by Polish law. But it does not provide women with means, legal or administrative, to establish a man's paternity before a baby's birth. The draft bill created a furor. Parliamentarians and critics argued passionately. The issue split political alliances and allied erstwhile opponents. Solidarity supported it, promises, as did both Tadeusz Mazowiecki and Lech Walesa during their presidential campaigns. Press silence on the bill leads Fuzara to infer the press disagrees but fears criticizing it. 95% of Poles consider themselves Catholic, but most, 57%, also believe that one should not follow religious dictates one finds morally wrong. A greater number consciously make exceptions to rules of religious observance. The first outcry against imprisoning women who aborted was so vociferous that before the bill was sent to the Senate in August 1990, that clause was removed. The Senate heard it read in January 1991 and sent it to a committee for consideration, then asked people to write in their opinions. In the last poll before the vote, 13% of the population would ban abortion entirely, as in the bill. 33% would allow it in special circumstances, endangerment of the mother's well-being or impregnation against her will. 26% would add economic difficulties to those conditions, and 23% wanted all abortion legal. The Catholic Church had already won one battle. The socialist state had subsidized all drugs, including birth control pills. But in May, the government eliminated subsidies for birth control pills on the Jesuitical ground that avoiding pregnancy is not a sickness. Removing the subsidy tripled the price of birth control pills for an already impoverished population. The decision was announced only days before the bill criminalizing abortion came to a vote in the parliament. In May 1991, the legislators rejected the total ban on abortion sought by the Catholic Church, but adopted a non-binding resolution petitioning the government to ban abortions by private doctors, whom women prefer, so that abortion does not appear in public records. Consider the logic and the consequences of these policies. Poland is teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. It cannot adequately feed, house, educate, or provide medical care to its people. Instead of concentrating its energies on finding ways to improve the economic situation, the government caves into the church and obsesses about women's body. In the process, it puts women in an impossible situation, deprives of birth control pills by their expense, and perhaps deprived of abortion by law. Women will be forced either to deny themselves and their husbands sexual intercourse and risk men's violence, or to bear more children than they can afford or can care for. The situation is similar in other nations where religions dictate government policy. While sex is linked to having babies, and fertility rates affect and are affected by economic and political conditions, economic and political problems cannot be solved by men controlling women's bodies. For men to focus on controlling women's reproduction to solve a society's problems seems nothing short of mad or at best superstitious. But men's superstition, or insanity, has real and dire consequences for the women who are its object. And states, too, home in on women's bodies. Perhaps to create the illusion that men are in control of uncontrollable forces. Indeed, almost all governments try to control women's bodies and regulate their appearance in some way. State domination of women's bodies. Ancient states often regulated women's dress and adornment. The Greek lawgiver Solon, 7th century BCE, tried to codify the proper demeanor of women in every sphere of life. Their dinner parties, their walks and expenditures, and like present-day Muslims, established a women's police to spy on them. In China, into the early years of our century, the feet of many upper-class women were crippled by binding. It is inconceivable that this be done to men. Chinese men were explicit about the reason for foot binding. Why must feet be bound? To prevent uncivilized running around. The toes, twisted back under the instep as a child's bones grew, formed a kind of fist, which became a sexual fetish. Chinese pornographic art shows men using the open space in the deformed foot as an entry for the penis. As women began to move into the public realm in 19th century Europe and America, fashion produced clothes that highly exaggerated the breasts and buttocks, and so constricted their waists that they could not breathe. Girls grew up with deformed rib cages. Some even died. When Chiang Kai-shek entered Shanghai in 1927 at the head of the Kuomintang forces, KMT, the Chinese Nationalist Party, he targeted mainly women. His soldiers hunted down women who had bobbed hair, wore masculine clothes, or had chosen their own fiancés. Chiang's soldiers stripped to the waist women wearing men's clothes and paraded them publicly so every man in town may see she is in reality a woman. Before killing them, they shot women with short hair for radicalism and wrapped them in gasoline-soaked blankets and burned them alive. Everywhere, KMT agents or troops physically mutilated suspected women. often hacking off their noses or breasts and raping them before they killed them. One young woman was tortured for having freely chosen her fiance, then shot 17 times. KNT soldiers shrieked at young women they were about to behead. You have your free love now. We may believe that today only Islam regulates women's appearance, but secular states also treat it as a matter for male judgment and regulation. In most countries, women, but not men, are forbidden by law from going into public without shirts. In an action by a business, not a state, but one on which state law will ultimately rule, Continental Airlines in 1991 dismissed a woman for refusing to wear makeup. Presumably, a man would be dismissed for wearing it. Women's appearance has far more bearing on their employment in television and films than men's, and only women actors are required to maintain a skeletal weight. Women's appearance is a matter of state importance in many newly independent states, where Western dress on women, not men, is taken as a sign of Western influence, which is unacceptable in women, not men. Samora Machel, the socialist revolutionary who became president of Mozambique, was dedicated to women's rights, yet warned against Western cultural imperialism. He feared what he called the mechanical emancipation of women typical of capitalist countries. An emancipated woman is one who drinks, smokes, wears trousers and miniskirts, who indulges in sexual promiscuity, who refuses to have children. Iranian feminist Azar Tabari remarks, what is culturally imperialist about women drinking, smoking, wearing trousers, miniskirts, indulging in sexual promiscuity, and refusing to have children? What a crime against the nation. If someone had said that drinking, smoking, and so forth in general, and not only for women, constituted cultural imperialism, he or she would in all probability be accused of being totally ignorant of the rich cultural traditions of the Third World. Did not tobacco smoking come from American Indians? What about Khayyam's poetry about a cup of wine and a loaf of bread and thou? And didn't our indigenous women in the rural hinterlands always wear trousers? Sexuality and reproduction. Most countries try to regulate sexuality by regulating women. Some enforce virginity before marriage and fidelity afterward. Almost all criminalize prostitution, but only for the prostitutes, who are usually women. Men make up roughly 10% of prostitutes in most societies, but sex work is associated with women. Male temple priests in Sumer are believed to have invented prostitution at about the 3rd millennium BCE, using priestesses to draw income to the temple. In probably all past patriarchal societies, it was the only occupation in which some women could earn enough to survive. It is still the only one in which poor, uneducated women can earn a decent living. Men are also almost exclusively the consumers of this service. Yet men outlaw prostitution and invented penitentiaries. Harsh prisons in which to repent sin, to punish under the guise of reform those who followed it. Efforts to punish male customers by publicizing their names invariably draw such outrage in high places that they are rescinded. In societies like the Philippines and parts of Southeast Asia, an important component of the economy is based in prostitution, from which men profit far more than women, many of whom are virtual slaves. States long ago arrogated the right to determine whether women had access to contraception or abortion. States have never tried to stop men from obtaining condoms, although churches have, but years of lobbying by feminists was necessary before they allowed women to learn about or possess contraceptives. Not just Catholic states like Ireland, but secular states as well intervene in women's reproduction. Socialist states like Romania or China imposed the most stringent controls on reproduction because they could, exercising almost total control over their citizens. Even after socialism collapsed in Eastern Europe, some states, eager to placate men or churches, continue to sacrifice women's special needs for legal abortion, maternity allowances, and parental leave with guaranteed job protection. In some former socialist states, the Catholic Church drives the campaign to control women's bodies, but nationalist movements not directly linked to any religion show the same inclination. Many Eastern European nationalist movements are reviving the fascist ideals of militarism, a cult of manhood and male dominance, discipline, obedience, uniformity, and cult of folk with a very narrow base of solidarity, like Hitler's Aryanism, which leads to xenophobia of all types, but especially anti Semitism, and to efforts to put women's bodies under male control. All militaristic societies repress women. Abortion has been a major item of contention in the unification of East and West Germany, the East having had a liberal abortion policy and the West a severely restrictive policy. It is highly likely that abortion will be criminalized in Eastern Germany, Hungary, and Serbia, where nationalism has taken a particularly virulent form, reporter Celestine Bolin writes. Serbs make up 70% of the official officer corps of the Yugoslavian National Army and seem to have a militaristic society. At present, the government is debating a punitive tax on married couples with no children, implying a strong pro-natalist policy. Romania. This is Romania's section. Until 1966, abortion was legal in Romania, and women depended on it because contraceptives were shoddy and hard to find. All socialist states produce poor quality contraceptives in inadequate numbers, perhaps because they want women to bear many children, despite the difficulties of raising them. But they also seem not to produce sanitary napkins or tampons, a shocking lack in the 20th century. Maybe anything female gets short shrift. Romania had over 1 million recorded abortions and 274,000 live births in 1965. 80.3% of known pregnancies were aborted. Nicolae Ceausescu, who ruled Romania dictatorially until the 1989 coup d'etat, wanted more workers. In 1965, he decided the way to get them was to ban abortion. The next year, births doubled to 528,000, but factory production fell. Ceausescu had forgotten, as men tend to do, that women work and cannot work and give birth simultaneously. Impoverished Romanian women resorted to illegal abortion. Live births declined, but the maternal death rate rose from 85.9 per 100,000 live births in 1966 to 96.2 1968 to 139.9 1981. In England and Wales, 9 of every 100,000 mothers die giving birth, 15.5 in France. In England, 22% of maternal deaths result from abortion. In Romania, 85.6%. Women ill from botched abortions often did not seek medical help because of the ban. But ban or no, by 1983, the birth rate was what it was in 1966, 14.3 per 1,000 population. Cosiscu, I'll show you it. There it is. Koshescu then required all women to have monthly medical examinations to determine whether they were pregnant. He placed a high tax on unmarried people over 25 and on childless couples without medical certification of infertility and barred contraceptive imports from the West. Women of childbearing age without proof of the monthly exam could not get free medical care or driver's licenses. Perhaps fertile women began to forego sex to avoid pregnancy. Suddenly, the population showed a huge rise in stress. In addition, the infant mortality rate rose, and the number of babies available for adoption swelled. In 1985, the official infant mortality rate in Romania was 25.6 deaths per 1,000 infants under a year. The 1983 rate in Sweden was 7, France 9, the United States 10.9, Czechoslovakia 15.6. And this rate was achieved only by bureaucratic juggling. New York Times reporter B. Meredith Burke writes that the actual rate was 60 to 80% higher. Even so, after the 1899 coup, Romanian orphanages were overflowing with unwanted children. And while the new government had legalized abortion, it also seeks to curtail it. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Japan is next.